Okay, so firstly, I'd like to thank the organising committee for inviting me to give the opening keynote for this conference. In truth, I've seen the conference unfold across my Twitter feed for a number of years and always said to myself, one day. Well, that one day is this day, and for that I'm grateful. I'm also grateful to Loughborough University for allowing me to attend. Before I begin, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining me today, despite my somewhat depressing title and the troubles that may have given you pause for thought for attending. So thanks for being here. You can thank my friend and mentor David Kirk for the title, not the troubles. Well, at least in the spirit of it, that David always invited me to present the problem first and the solution second. Why? Because bad news made good is better than the reverse. Before I go on to talk, I'd just like to explain why I'm reading from a script. I'll try not to as much, but I have a stutter. So I find if I have my ideas down, I don't stutter, and I also stay on task. So that's the reason why I'm doing this. I'm going to try to engage with you as much as I can. Okay, so given David's impact on my career, you won't be surprised to hear me use his work on physical education futures in this keynote to argue against more of the same physical education and subsequently the end or extinction of the subject we love. Instead, I will argue for radical reform and urge that we reconsider what we see as the end or purpose of physical education. Ultimately, I ask that we collectively and individually strive to make physical education better for the young people we serve, and therefore for the older people like us that they eventually become. That said, please be ready for the good news and the positive messages. It is not all doom and gloom. Finally, please be ready for the work that inevitably comes along with our efforts to instigate change. Please feel free to stop me at any point and ask questions. So the end of physical education. Physical education is a subject that is most often found at the periphery of education. Its place has been maintained by its engagement in, and as I will argue, our engagement in a number of questionable discourses, or perhaps more cynically, the ability to jump on a succession of bandwagons, none of which has cemented its place in the center of school life. Its diet of school sport and its appetite for traditional practices, many of which are wounded, scarred, or fatally flawed, have seen physical education perpetually involved in a fight for its very existence. Some may disagree and may argue that rocking the boat now may simply serve to undo all the hard work to date to secure physical education's place in the core curriculum. I acknowledge their point of view, but enact my right as keynote to disagree for the reasons I will now go on to state. In this address, I will argue that physical education has blindly served a number of convenient narratives, or gods, for the sake of poetic license. Physical education has served an additional pantheon of its own, i.e. talent identification, youth engagement, obesity resolution, and of course team sports. In the case of PE, I will argue that teachers and administrators have adopted what Berlant calls cruel optimism, a term I will revisit later, in their worship of these gods. But I've experienced little in the way of meaningful shift to the heart of the school. I'll argue there is no point in going back to a past where physical education as sport techniques worked, especially if it is just replacing what children can access in the community. And we'll conclude by expounding the values of a different approach, a models-based approach, in my case, to achieve the ends of physical education that we most desire. I'll begin by talking about the gods of education and physical education and progress from there. So our gods, small g. Right in the end of the last century, Neil Postman pronounced the end of education, contending that it had a number of failing or failed gods. Using gods as a substitute for narratives Using gods as a substitute for narratives, he reasoned that certain ideas about education afford education a sense of authority, continuity, and purpose, whilst promoting piety, obedience, and faith in even the most skeptical of teachers, students, and parents or legal guardians. These gods, he argued, give point to our labours, exalt our history, elucidate the present, and give direction to our futures. Why else, he commented, would children endure school? Why else would we send children to school knowing, as we do, our own experiences of compliance and boredom, as ultimately and intimately as we do? In short, Postman held that schooling, in its current guise, persists because of the existence of shared narratives, the capacity for such narratives to provide and ensure a reason for schooling. Given what he saw as the failure of education, Postman contended that school, as both a technical response and a metaphysical construct, would not exist in its current form without our enduring narrative in which we could place our faith. Given enduring political concerns about failing education systems, schooling, in its current guise, survives because of some bigger reasons or for bigger reason or reasons. Postman referred to these reasons as the gods our students are presently asked to serve. The first of Postman's gods is the god of economic unity, which coldly promises that if young people sit quietly in school, listen, ask questions, revise the body of knowledge chosen for them, and do well in their exams, they will get a good job. This job will, in turn, allow them to serve the second of Postman's gods, the god of consumership, whose narrative holds that whoever dies with the most toys wins. The third goal, the god of technology, requires allegiance to technology's ability to always be right and its ability to solve any problem. There are other gods in Postman's pantheon, but it's beyond the scope of this keynote to discuss these. What there is time to discuss is the crisis of narrative that Postman saw and the decline of the once sturdy gods of education that he warned us against. The narrative of the god of economic unity is sustained by the idea that you are what you do for a living. It has been irrevocably damaged in many countries by high unemployment, factory closures, and the relocation of key industries overseas. Despite this, the god of consumerism has thrived, albeit in a manner that sees advertisers targeting young children as young as 3 in an effort to sell them the dream of mass accumulating stuff. The god of technology continues to have huge support both in education and beyond. That said, the sheer volume of data now produced in schools does as much to limit education as it does to enhance it. Simultaneously, countless number of technological distractions drag children away from the real world and physical activity, but these are discussions for another day. The reality is that physical education isn't often seen as a key contributor to the worship of these gods. Instead, it is seen as both as a break from such piety, obedience, and faith, and/or a distraction, especially when you consider physical education has narratives on gods of its own to worship. So the demigods of physical education. In the case of physical education, and using Postman's metaphor, I argue that there are subject-specific demigods whose own promises are either failing or have failed. These are the demigods of talent identification, youth engagement, obesity resolution, and team sports, which I mentioned earlier. Theirs are the narratives that have sustained the subjects for decades, and which repeatedly and increasingly fail to stimulate engagement in physical activity by young people. In their study of in their analysis of 64 studies across 47 different countries of global participation in sport and leisure time physical activities, Holton et al. Concluded that walking, running, and swimming may be the most beneficial activities to promote with young people due to issues of cost and access in later life. And yet these are not often activities offered in many PE curriculum. When this conclusion is contrasted with Ferry and Lund's argument that the offering of school sports is both narrow and historically tailored to the time-honored tastes of native boys, well-educated parents, and team sports, the maxim of supply and demand in physical education seems broken beyond repair. Many of our scholars have argued that physical education has taken a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching. Ennis et al. Described this as an exposure approach to sports-based physical education and argued it was designed to expose children to different sports in the hope that they might find something of interest to them now and in the future. The historical adherence to a repeatedly criticized exposure to short units of traditional games smacks of Berlant's notion of cruel optimism, which he defined as a relationship or attachment to a compromised conditions of possibility whose realization is discovered either to be impossible, sheer fantasy, or too possible, and therefore toxic. Berlant argued that when a person has X in their life, and X in my argument is the all too possible and toxic multi-activity curriculum, they might not do well if X is removed. And even X's presence threatens their well-being, which many scholars believe the multi-activity curriculum does for PE. In Berlant's eyes, cruel optimism is the condition of maintaining an attachment to a significantly problematic object. In the pursuit of a good life, i.e. the halcyon days of physical education Ferry and Lund talked about, which is for so many a bad life that wears out the subject nevertheless. Put differently, in maintaining the curriculum status quo in physical education, we are failing the needs of young people. This is what Kirk termed the decline and fall of physical education. Drawing on the work of Steiner et al., Kirk argued that physical education faces extinction unless it radically reforms its dominant model of teaching games and sports, what he termed physical education as sport techniques. He equated any continuation of dominant practices of physical education with extinction and cautioned against apathy. Kirk also highlighted that teachers have historically been reluctant to bring about radical reform, in a large part due to their disinclination to live with the disruption of routines of everyday life. Indeed, he recognized, as I have in my own work, that such change might be considered as work plus work, i.e. doing the work expected of you and then doing the work needed to change your practice. He argued that such work was needed to save the subject. Kirk recognized and argued against the call for more time, more facilities, and more teachers, stating instead that these weren't solutions for an already endangered species. Indeed, as MacDonald argued, we need to stop ignoring what, where, and how young people learn and how they engage with and act upon digital technologies and the cultures they produce. More is an outdated solution. Robinson argues that we need to disenthrall ourselves with 20th century solutions to the problems we see in education. Fullen goes on and argues that we need to become entangled in a drive to create better versions of what was needed for the 20th century, instead of creating and implementing a more future-orientated education for all kids. Returning to Postman and his gods, we come to see that education will endure because of its bigger stories of economic unity and consumership. Will endure because of its bigger stories and will not be mortally harmed by smaller stories of boring lessons, bewildering subject matter choices. However, the stories of PE, for example, media portrayals of dominant, competitive, aggressive, not too bright individuals, may not be as easy as those of education to survive. Indeed, Kirk argued that the likely demise of physical education as a school subject will come through apathy and a belief that we need to do nothing new because our demigods are robust enough to survive. I argue the opposite. I argue that we need to recognize the failing health of our dominant narratives and invest in new ones. We need to celebrate the good and eradicate the bad and the ugly. We need to comprehend the gods and demigods we have in common with our students and find the types of physical education we want in the future. To do this, I present an argument for models-based practice as a new narrative for physical education. However, I do not suggest that this is the only future, but present it as an example. In doing this, I do not simply regurgitate an argument for the use of single, standalone units of work that employ a single or composite instructional curriculum or pedagogical model. Instead, I argued for a sustained and meaningful use of a range of pedagogical models across the decade or more of compulsory physical education, now common in many countries. I do not, as some might believe, advocate for a slavish adherence to a blueprint of a given model. I believe, as I've argued elsewhere, in the adaptive qualities and site-specific flexibility of models-based practice. Finally, I do not argue that model-based practice is the only way. Physical education should be taught and conceptualized. Instead, as I repeat, I believe that it is one possible form of radical reform, and I wish to encourage a debate of ideas in the field and a reassessment of the narratives we currently serve. In some ways, this keynote moves the arguments in physical education futures forward by offering up a concrete notion of radical reform. It is a first step to greater clarity and understanding, one that I hope will challenge you to think differently about physical education and break new ground in our subject's mission to find better gods or demigods, or narratives, to point our labors, exalt our history, elucidate the present, and give direction to the future. To do this, local action is vitally important, and we need to help our colleagues in our schools to envision and enact broader notions of curriculum change. So, new ends to physical education. If we, you and I, can agree that we need to change the ends, i.e. the dominant narratives of physical education, then we also need to consider what any new ends might be and how they might achieve and what they might achieve. I use the plural ends to suggest that we need to think differently in the future. Green argued that there is a disconnect between teachers' aspirations to help students to be active for life and the things the self-serve teachers teach and how they teach. Similarly, Hellison held that while many ends are frequently attributed to physical education, i.e. leadership, personal responsibility, grit, determination, and cooperation, to name a few, there is no empirical evidence to support these claims that this is what young people learn. If these are the desired outcomes of our subject, and we will each have our own, then we need to find ways of changing our teaching to achieve them, to teach them, and to help young people learn them. We need to stop exposing students to sports, only sports, and start planning for learning across multiple domains of learning. In the first chapter of their book, Models of Teaching, Joyce and Whale argued that urged us to avoid the search for a perfect single model of teaching, regardless of how attractive it might appear. Instead, they asked us to focus on the rich variety of models of teaching which our heritage has given us. More than a decade later, Jowett and Bain firstly queried why physical education existed in schools in the first place, and then asked us what curricula that supported and extended that existence should look like. In answering their own questions, Jowett and Bain reasoned that curriculum development should involve the problematization of both the philosophy and goals of physical education and the design of the instructional program. Specifically, they argued that the development of a curriculum is the creation of an environment that provides students with a set of experiences. Further, they held that curriculum design was both science and art, with the scientists procuring facts about learning and instructional strategies, and the artists addressing human qualities of the program. Human qualities of the program, the intensity and the beauty and the joy of the day-to-day experience. Jarrett and Bain's aspiration that curriculum design in physical education would occur at a local level, despite, there is little evidence to suggest that this happened, at least not on a large scale. In questioning the future of physical education, Penny and Chandler argued, perhaps the most critical failure of physical education is that the implications of the various aims of the curriculum design, teaching and learning have been inadequately explored, and further, in the absence of such inquiry, we have witnessed, in England and Wales, if not elsewhere, the emergence of a particular dominant form and focus. The form and focus that we refer to has become established to the point that it has attained the status of being the obvious, and many people, most notably members of the public and politicians, but surely also many within the profession itself, see it as the only possible structure and orientation for the subject. Having a single structure for physical education suggests that the similarities of provision across contexts far outweigh the differences, such as being the acceptance of a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching and learning in physical education, that Locke felt it better to chuck the dominant model and thereby most school programs and start from scratch. As if in response to Locke's suggestion, Seed and Top and Tannehill preference their fourth edition of their book, Developing Teaching Skills in Physical Education, with the question, what does it take to deliver an effective, meaningful physical education in the context of today's schools? In a marked change from the first three editions, Seed and Top and Tannehill included a substantial amount about curriculum, particularly what they term curriculum models, but which we might recognize as pedagogical models. They argued that through the process of development, refinement, what Jarrett and Bain described as translating a conceptual framework into a curriculum model, a main theme or focus curricula have enjoyed widespread adoption. The overriding message to emerge from the literature on the use of main-themed or focus curricula, be that a single or hybrid composite model, is that it works, and it works well. Indeed, there are now thousands of research papers exploring various models, many of which point to the great success. Advocacy, what we now recognize as individual pedagogical models, through the presentation of curriculum and specification, started in the 1970s with play education, and in the 1980s with teaching gains for understanding, self-responsibility, and sport education, and continue today. Metzler recognized 8 pedagogical models, and new ones are being regularly proposed. For example, health-based physical education, adventure, practicing, and practice fluency. What is just emerging into the literature is the idea of radical reform through a models-based practice approach to physical education, one that uses multiple models to teach the main ideas of the subject, i.e. physical, cognitive, social, and affective learning, or put differently, social responsibility, individual accountability, competency, and practice and movement. So what is models-based approach? A models-based approach is one that aligns intended learning outcomes with different pedagogical models. It takes the approach that if you want to teach social responsibility or social interdependence, you don't change the sport, but the pedagogy. You might use the sport as a vehicle for change, but the road to learning is the model. When it comes to teaching students to value the physically active life, you learn about health-based physical education, and then you use it to teach them. When you want competent, literate, and enthusiastic sports people, you use sport education. A common misconception of pedagogical models is that they are programs in and of themselves. A cursory glance at sport education and teaching gains for understanding, however, reveals that this is not so. In each of these well-known and frequently used approaches to physical education, only broad guiding principles are provided. While Seed and Top provides 3 learning aspirations, competent, literate, and enthusiastic sports people, these take different forms in the versions of sport education developed by his colleagues and teachers and set out in their 1994 book. Similarly, Bunker and Thorpe's model is actually an attempt to represent the main components of games lessons and their sequencing so that sport techniques are not the first consideration for the teacher, as in the case of the traditional approaches. Indeed, sports techniques only come after the game form, game concept, and decision-making are considered. Jarrett and Bain make clear my point that models are not programs in and of themselves, but rather design specifications for the development of local programs. Seed and Top's incentive for proposing play education in the 1970s and then sport education in the 1980s was to establish was the establishment of non-educative aims he saw for physical education, i.e. the development of Right, ignore that now. Right. The development of physically, mentally, emotionally, and socially fit citizens through the medium of physical activities. Bunker and Thorpe, in their advocacy for teaching games for understanding, similarly noted the importance of using principles of play when teaching game skills. They argued for the need for the what. Oh, no, I've got that one. They argued for the place of the why, i.e. the end, before the how, i.e. the act. In this way, the decision to play, for example, a badminton shot comes before the child learns the technique of the shot. In this, decision-making trumps skill execution every time. A models-based practice approach, in this sense, serves as a means of managing the tensions that exist between different stakeholders in curriculum reform, and indeed of holding a partnership between these parties together. This is because critical elements that typically have their origins in the innovative ideas of researchers and teachers and other agents external to the school are capable of being interpreted and adapted by teachers to fit the local context of implementation without losing the distinctive forms of the model itself. In other words, while there are critical elements of each model, such as sport education, they take a different substantive form in practice in each site in which they are implemented. In other words, there is no such thing as sport education. There is an approach to teaching called sport education that you can adapt within your own schools. By placing the emphasis on what is to be learned rather than on the dominant narratives or demigods of physical education, we come to see an alternative future for the subject. We stop using solely games in our search for future Olympians. We stop hoping that team games will get kids off the street while simultaneously addressing obesity. Instead, we start identifying our preferred ends of physical education, and we work to those. In summary, a models-based practice is a way of addressing this. It is not the way. This way does not exist. As you leave here and move about the conference, you will learn about lots of new and innovative stuff. I ask just one thing of you. Ask if the end justifies the means. If only by doing this we can influence the end, i.e. the purpose of physical education. Thank you.